As we've seen, the defining characteristic of Wahhabis is their hatred and backstabbing of the Ummah. Nothing better represents this than the alliance of the Wahhabis with the British in the early 20th century. The Wahhabis experienced a re-emergence of political power due to the military campaigns led by Abdulaziz ibn Saud. Ibn Saud reconquered Riyadh in 1902 and over the next decade expanded his rule across Najd. But Ibn Saud wasn't satisfied with Najd alone. He desired to annex the Hijaz with Mecca and Medina, a goal that had eluded earlier members of the Saud dynasty. Annexing the Hijaz required defeating the Ottomans and the Arab tribes allied with the Ottomans. The opportunity to defeat these superior Ottoman forces came with World War I. In 1914, the Ottomans issued a jihad proclamation, calling on the world's Muslims to fight back against the British and other allied European powers who were threatening to destroy the caliphate. But Ibn Saud and the Wahhabis rejected this call for Muslim unity. In fact, Ibn Saud saw this as the perfect time to go the opposite direction and formalize an alliance with the British. In 1915, Ibn Saud signed the Treaty of Darin. This treaty made the Wahhabi Najd a British protectorate. The treaty formalized Ibn Saud and the Wahhabis as allies of the British against the Ottomans in World War I. As a reward for backstabbing the Ottomans, the British formally recognized Najd and offered it British protection. They also gave Ibn Saud a £20,000 loan and a shipment of arms, as well as a monthly stipend of £5,000. Isn't it amazing that just £5,000 a month is all it took for the Wahhabis to sell out the Ummah to the enemies of Islam? The Wahhabis knew the British were invading and massacring Muslims, burning down their homes and their mosques, but they sided with the British anyway and celebrated when Sunni Muslims were being slaughtered. If you think I'm exaggerating about any of this, just consider the Fatwa from top Wahhabi authority Sulaiman ibn Sahman, who lived from 1850 to 1930. Ibn Sahman was one of the highest ranking authorities in the entire history of the Wahhabi movement. Ibn Sahman's fatwa has been preserved as a historical manuscript by King Saud University, and at the time of this recording, you can still download it directly from their manuscript database. The fatwa states that Ottoman Sunni Muslims are all kafir murtads. Furthermore, their level of kufr is worse than that of Jews and Christians who are standard kafirs, or what they term kafir asli. Question: what is your opinion regarding the Ottoman Turkish state and the Christians? May Allah curse them all. Which of the two is greater in disbelief, and which of the two groups deserves to be granted victory over the other? Answer: the disbelief of these people, the cursed Turkish state, is more severe than that of the Jews and Christians, and far more harmful to Islam and the Muslims than the Christians. This is because they're apostates from Islam, and the apostate is more severe in disbelief than the disbeliever who is never a Muslim, i.e. kafir asli. There is no doubt that these apostates from among the Turkish soldiers and others are more disbelieving than the Jews and Christians, as is well known from the words of Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah. As he explicitly stated regarding the Nusayris, it is known that they outwardly display Islam, that they pronounce the two testimonies of faith, that they perform Friday and congregational prayers, and they appoint Sharia judges as they did when they took control of Egypt. So Ibn Sahman is citing Ibn Taymiyyah and claiming that Ibn Taymiyyah's opinion about Nusayris applies to the Ottomans. Now, to understand how crazy this is, you have to realize who the Nusayris are. Nusayris believe that Ali ibn Abi Talib is literally God. They believe Ali is the divine incarnation of God, and they worship him as God. So of course Ibn Taymiyyah and all other Muslim scholars throughout history said that Nusayris are not Muslim. But how in the world are you going to compare Nusayris who believe God was a man walking the earth with Sunni Ottomans? How completely insane is this? If you remember, this is exactly the twisted logic of Ibn Abdul Wahhab, who said that the Sunni Muslims of Syria, Egypt, Iraq, Yemen, Mecca, and Medina were all mushriks worse than Abu Jahl. Why? Because some people in those places have Sufi practices like istighatha. Therefore, because of auto takfir and chain takfir, they're all mushriks worse than Abu Jahl. This is the deviant Wahhabi takfir doctrine we discussed earlier. And as we've seen, Ibn Taymiyyah has nothing to do with this deviance. Never did Ibn Taymiyyah mass takfir Sufis or entire regions where Sufis practicing istighatha lived. Yet here is this so-called scholar Ibn Sahman citing Ibn Taymiyyah and applying Ibn Taymiyyah's opinion about Nusayris in order to mass takfir the Sunni Ottomans. Now, the second part of the question that was asked was, who should the Muslims want to be victorious, the British or the Ottoman Turks? To answer this, Ibn Sahman refers to the Sirah. He points out that when the Persians and the Romans were at war, the Sahaba were cheering for the Romans. Why? Because at least the Romans were Christians and were al-Kitab, meaning people of the book, whereas the Persians of the time were mushrik fire worshippers. So on that basis, the Sahaba were more in favor of the Romans. Ibn Sahman applies this logic to the British and the Ottomans. Once it becomes clear to you that the Persians were worshippers of statues and idols, and that the Romans were people of the book, and that the polytheists among Qurayshi disbelievers rejoiced at the victory of the Persians over the Romans because both were idol worshippers, and that the Messenger of Allah ﷺ and his companions rejoiced at the victory of the Romans over the Persians because they were people of the book, and although both groups, Persians and Romans, were disbelievers who had never been Muslim, the Muslims rejoiced at the Romans' victory because they were people of the book, while the Persians were not, but rather idolaters. It's also known that the disbelief of the apostate is more severe than that of the disbeliever who has never been Muslim, i.e. kafir asli. We have already established with evidence. Therefore, rejoicing at the victory of the people of the book over idol worshippers in our time, i.e. the Turks, is even more appropriate. This is because they are apostates, so their disbelief is worse than the disbelief of those who have never been Muslim. Keep in mind that in 1915, the Ottoman Caliphate included not only Turkey, but also Syria, Palestine, Iraq, and the Hijaz, meaning Mecca and Medina. According to Ibn Sahman, Muslims in all these regions are apostate kafir mushriks, whose disbelief is more severe than that of Christians and Jews. Therefore, the real Muslims, meaning the Wahhabis, should hope and pray that the British invaders wipe them all out. This shocking fatwa is not well known because Wahhabis have aggressively hidden these historical documents which reveal the truth about their movement. The fatwa was endorsed by Abdullah ibn Abdul Latif, who was a direct descendant of Ibn Abdul Wahhab and was the highest ranking Wahhabi scholar of his time. Abdullah was also the direct teacher of Ibn Saud. Ibn Saud, who would eventually found the modern Saudi state, truly believed the Wahhabi doctrine that the British were superior to Sunni Muslims. All of this is reported by Harry St. John Philby. Philby was a high-ranking British colonial intelligence officer who served as advisor to Ibn Saud and was one of Ibn Saud's close friends. Philby reports his conversations with Ibn Saud in the book Arabia of the Wahhabis, published in 1928. Philby says in this book, Ibn Saud hastened to explain that most of their time had been spent in close contact with their English hosts and that they had seen but little of the local Muslims. He then seized the opportunity of launching out into one of his favorite themes, the comparative merits of Christians and non-Wahhabi Muslims, lumped together in the category of mushrikeen. Why, he said, if you English were to offer me one of your daughters to wife, I would accept her, making only the condition that any children resulting from the marriage should be Muslims. But I would not take of the daughters of the Sharif, or of the people of Mecca, or other Muslims who we reckon as mushrikeen. I would eat of meat slain by the Christians without question. But it is the mushrik, he who associates others in worship with God, that is our abomination. As for Christians and Jews, here he quoted a text from the Quran. They are people of a book, though, and here somewhat naively he permitted himself a delightful dash of inconsistency. I like not the Jews. They are contemptible by reason of their too great love of money. Sincere as he was in his own religion, Ibn Saud was fully convinced of the practical advantages of a British alliance, and it seemed to me in these days that anything like a cordial reaction on our part would result surely and steadily in the establishment of the toleration of Christians as a basic factor of the Wahhabi creed. Ibn Saud conveys to this British colonial officer how Islam gives a higher status to Christians and Jews above non-Wahhabi Muslims. He also says his eagerness to ally with the British Empire against the so-called mushrikeen. Elsewhere, Ibn Saud even admits that he believes the Ottoman Turks are an inferior race. Ibn Saud, by way of commentary on a Quranic chapter he had read, turned to me and remarked that he was of the stock of Ismail. Cousins to you Christian Britons, for you are of the stock of Ishaq. The Turks, he said, were Awlad Iblis, meaning children of the devil, being Tatars by origin. According to Ibn Saud, the British and the Wahhabis are cousins because the British are descended from Isaac and the Wahhabis are descended from Ishmael. But the Ottoman Turks are nothing more than the children of Satan. Philby continues, thus in every way within his power, Ibn Saud, in preparation for his coming campaign, was laying the foundations of a general acceptance of his basic policy of an alliance with Britain. Ibn Saud's hatred for Sunni Muslims resulted in numerous massacres that have been extensively documented by historians. For example, did you know that the Wahhabis murdered over 3,000 Yemeni pilgrims? In 1923, Ibn Saud's paramilitary gangs shot dead over 3,000 Yemeni pilgrims who were heading towards Mecca to perform the annual Hajj. When the Yemenis arrived in the southern provinces, one of Ibn Saud's gangs started shooting the pilgrims, killing 3,105 of them. This massacre is documented in the book The Great Massacre of Pilgrims by Professor Hamoud al-Ahnoumi. Professor Ahnoumi claims that this massacre took place for a number of reasons. Ahnoumi says that Ibn Saud did not want the Yemenis to interfere with his plans to conquer the Hijaz in alliance with Britain. Ahnoumi also says that this massacre was a British acceptance test for Ibn Saud, so that Ibn Saud could prove to the British that he was willing to do anything they asked. Britain was preparing Ibn Saud to be its first man and main agent in the region, who would implement its disruptive and differentiating project, but it wanted him to carry out an acceptance test that would qualify him to be its man who could carry out an ugly thing it asked of him. At the time of Ibn Saud, another Wahhabi massacre took place in Ta'if. As mentioned earlier, in 1803, there was an infamous massacre in Ta'if which saw the Wahhabis kill 200 Sunnis. In 1924, they carried out another massacre where they massacred 500 Sunnis. Then they robbed the remaining residents, leaving them no food. As a result, thousands starved to death. This is all described in the book The Hijaz by Malik Dahlan, published by Oxford University Press in 2018. The book collects the testimonies of multiple eyewitness accounts of the atrocities. British diplomats played down the situation in their initial reports, but as more refugees arrived from Ta'if and it became clear that a number of British subjects had been killed or robbed during the attack, the evidence of Wahhabi brutality became clear. Yasin Khan, the Indian pilgrimage officer, wrote, "After the occupation of the town, the Wahhabis behaved most brutally, killing the peaceful inhabitants treacherously and indiscriminately. About 500 to 800 men are said to have been killed. 7 men were taken out to ransom of £7,000. Dr. Muniruddin submitted another account of events as described by his patients who had fled Ta'if. On 2nd of September, they heard firing of bullets outside the walls of Ta'if. Ibn Saud's men entered the town in the afternoon of September 5th with the words, 'Heaven for you, slaughter these mushrikeen, these kuffar, these enemies of Allah.' They then made their way towards the tomb of Abdullah ibn Abbas, demolished the cupola, leveled the grave to the ground, and set fire there with the words, 'Demolish the cupola of the mushrikeen that they worship.' From that time onward, the bullets were shot all over indiscriminately into the houses of the town until 8 a.m. on the Saturday. When they entered a house, they leveled their guns and pointed swords and knives towards the inmates and demanded that they surrender all gold and other coins. As soon as gold was collected, the adults were often shot dead. On Saturday, some people were made to carry the dead bodies towards the tomb of Abdullah ibn Abbas. The dead bodies were thrown there with the words that these kafirs need not to be buried but should be left there for the dogs to devour. Dead bodies were also tied with rope and dragged by mules. Some soldiers of the Hashemite government who were left in the town threw off their uniforms and joined the common people as Arabs so as to be saved from being slaughtered. The testimony of another eyewitness, Runsi Ihsanullah, a British subject, described how the inhabitants of Ta'if were taken outside the town into Shubra, with no personal belongings or clothing except what they were wearing, while the Wahhabis collected all the valuables found in their homes. In the next 3 days, no food was given to the captured, and when they were allowed to return to Ta'if, most decided to flee to other villages as nothing was left in their homes. During that exodus, many died on the way with no access to water. That event brought the estimated number of dead into the thousands. Another account states that the survivors were made to walk to Mecca barefoot in their underclothes with instructions to deliver a message that the Wahhabis were on their way, and those who supported Sharif Hussein would meet the fate of Ta'if. Otherwise, they would be spared. The atrocities reflect the extreme poverty of the Bedouin from the famished desert tribes, but also the political extremism inherent in the Wahhabi doctrine. In order to justify the killing of fellow Muslims, they first proclaimed them kuffar and mushrikeen. They also reportedly called the conventional Sunni administration of the Prophet Muhammad a form of idolatry. When you understand this history, you recognize that it's not an exaggeration to say that Wahhabis today literally prefer the US, Israel, and European powers over other Muslims. You might have thought I was exaggerating when I said that Wahhabis are working with the enemies of Islam today to slaughter Palestinians and betray and backstab the Ummah. But what do you think now that you know the history and you've seen their statements in black and white? Still think I'm exaggerating? From the very beginning of the Saudi state, the Wahhabis conspired with the Europeans against the Caliphate and against the wider Ummah. Remember the Ibn Sahman Fatwa from 1915? At this time, the Caliphate began calling all the Muslims of the world to support them against the British. The Wahhabis, however, favored the British to destroy the Ottomans, their fellow Muslims, which would allow the Wahhabis to then retake Hijaz and the Arabian Peninsula. This is exactly what happened at the end of the war, leading to the collapse of the Ottoman Caliphate and the seizure of its lands, including Palestine, which was then given to Jews to establish Israel. And of course, the rest of the Arab lands were divided up into nation states, creating the dysfunctional mess known as the modern Middle East we know today. The depressing situation we have today in Palestine and the Middle East is the result of exactly what the Wahhabis worked for. Wahhabis have for centuries stabbed the Ummah in the back. They've repeatedly celebrated when Muslims were attacked and killed by non-Muslims. They've always preferred non-Muslims dominating over the Muslims with so-called incorrect aqidah. Just like Ibn Saud worked with the British to destroy the Ottomans, Wahhabis in our time helped the US to destroy Iraq in 2 Gulf Wars. And we see many Wahhabis today encouraging and helping the US and Israel to destroy the Muslims in Palestine, Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, and Yemen. This is something no Muslim should ever forget.